have the honor to introduce a guest named Demi Wylde. And he is just so full of great information. Demi Wylde is a sex writer and educator who hosts a podcast called Hookup Horror Stories with Demi Wylde. And he runs a successful sex education channel on YouTube, which I was looking at this morning, and it is full of really great information. He is also the author of Deviant Diaries and A Deviant's Guide to Sex. So without further ado, I want to bring on Demi Wylde so that he can give us all of these great tidbits and tips. So without further ado, how are you doing today, Demi?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here talking with you, Eve.
Nice. Thank you for being here. I'm so excited to have you. And when I looked at your profile, I was really excited because it was just a different take on sexuality. And so I'm really excited to hear your perspective on things. So first of all, I just want to know what brought you to the point where you wanted to educate people on sexuality, and, what is your personal story?
Right. Well, I have a lot of lived experience, shall we say. I guess we'll go with my background. My sex ed was very sorely lacking. My early experiences growing up in Baptist Christianity led me to believe a lot of sex is very shameful. Being a queer kid, all that jazz really put a weird taste in my mouth around what sex it really is. But then in my teenage years, I was really inspired by Loveline and Dan Savage. And I also had an abusive relationship for a little while. I was like really, really experienced. I ran the gamut, I shall we say, of like, kind of just bad decisions and bad relationships and things. And I used kind of after a while, I used sex and drugs as a way to like escape. And eventually I made the decision to turn around and return back to writing and creating. I eventually published 2 books of poetry. Then I created my podcast, my blog, and now I'm working on becoming a sex and relationship coach. So I've really turned a lot of the negative experiences that I've had in my life into positive experiences, and I just want to share that with the world. And I don't know, why not?
Absolutely. And, you go from heartache to, teaching. And this, I've heard this sort of as a pattern almost in a lot of people's lives, is that they, go through really hard times and then they are able to come out of that on the other side and thrive. And you want to teach people because you don't want them to suffer like you did. So I can totally relate to that for sure. Tell me about what you think the red flags are in a relationship. We're going to start with the red flags and we'll go to the green ones after, but I want to hear
Oh
the red
yeah.
flags first.
Well, there's two kinds, I guess. There's little red flags and there's big red flags. Little red flags could be anything that might annoy you, such as like chewing with their mouth open or like being flaky. All these stuff just present issues to be aware of, it's kind of annoyances, and they certainly kind of up the ick factor of people. But there's also big red flags. There's the things that impact the quality of the relationship. Things like abusive language, signs of aggression. Being negligent of others' feelings, cheating, all that stuff. Being rude, all that stuff is like really big red flags for people. And so it's learning to discern which ones are just minor annoyances that you can maybe deal with, or which ones are like really big deal breakers for you.
Yes. And, it's interesting because I was looking at some video yesterday, and it was somebody talking about promiscuity and how, promiscuity for a lot of people is a red flag.
Mm-hmm.
And, to me, that word is a red flag, is the red flag, because it just comes with like so much societal, um, you know, shame, really, and so I'm just curious to know if you consider um, promiscuity, or if you consider body count as something that you look at when picking a partner.
Absolutely not. Okay, so this is probably the pot calling the kettle black, but I mean, I've lost count of myself of my body count. I mean, it's in the thousands. Who knows? Like, so I don't. But also, I'm a gay man, so like naturally, we do tend to have a lot more sex than say a heterosexual woman. So it is a weird thing. It's not a big deal. It's really body count really does not matter at all. Like, would you want to have sex with someone who didn't know what they were doing? Right? Like, I would not. I would like to know that someone has had experience, with boundaries, experience with consent, experience with, just, knowing what feels good to them. If you're wanting someone that is virginal, for lack of a better word, I suppose, I would maybe look at that and see why that is. Obviously there is a patriarchal part to that conversation to be had. But yeah, I also think that there's something kind of nefarious about that, about wanting someone who is so pure and quote unquote virginal. I think that's really strange. I think that's a red flag for me. But yeah,
I would
red
have
flags are
to agree.
subjective. Red flags are
Yes.
absolutely subjective. They depend on who you are, what you're looking for. My job is to just kind of like discern which ones are the big ones and which ones are the little ones.
Right, right. And, it's going to be very specific to each person. And, I was looking online today, and I found a conversation or a podcast. I'm not sure if it was a podcast, but it was some sort of video about how, how promiscuous women can be, red flags in relationships. And my eyes were crossing. I was listening to it and going, this is nuts. I mean, depending on your life situation, whether you get married young or later in life is going to determine how many people you have sex with and all of that. Because obviously, if you're an adult and you haven't gotten married until you were 30 something, I mean, the odds of you remaining a virgin is very low, so I just thought it was just crazy. But I'm curious now to know what you think the green flags are for relationships.
Before I get to that, I think you might have been looking down, like, say, the red pill part of the internet, where I think there is a large subsect of like men in particular that really think that sexuality is still taboo, and in a lot of cultures it is. But I think a lot of the work that you and I do is that we try to break this taboo, and we try to break these stigmas of people being owning their body, owning their sexuality, and owning their pleasure, right? As for green flags are things that make you feel good. They're the things like a sense of humor. They're supporting you in your endeavors, caring for their parents. I think that's a big one. If you like really like take care of your parents, or you have a really good relationship with them, that's a green flag. Like, that's a huge green flag. If your parents had a good relationship, that could be a green flag for people as well. So it's really identifying what things make you feel good, what things kind of resonate with you, and also things that might give a good feeling of what's to come in the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And having said that, I find that, being a good parent is definitely a green flag for me when I see,
Absolutely.
a person that knows how to take care of their children and, not just give them everything that they want, but, also, discipline them and, provide guidance. I find that to be a big green flag. And I personally talk about it as being a turn on because, it makes me like the person more. So definitely a green flag for me. And there's so many others. I mean, we could talk about that the whole podcast, but I won't go into all of the details of that because I want to talk about some other more spicy stuff. So
Yeah, but again, the
I
red and green flags are very subjective. They really depend on the
absolutely.
person. It's just kind of like understanding with self-awareness and like learning your personal boundaries and kind of looking at what your non-negotiables are and what you want a relationship to look like.
Absolutely. And, I often talk about, everything that people want in a relationship and, checking off all of those boxes and how it's very difficult for one person to, check off all of those boxes. So, yes, you can have a framework for what you want your relationship to look like and what you want in a relationship from the other person, their characteristics, behaviors, etc. But
Mhm.
not any one person is going to check all of your boxes. And so going into relationships with that in mind, I think is really important.
Definitely.
Yeah. I like to consider myself the face of safe sex. And
Yeah.
I'd love to discuss first what safe sex means to you.
Right. Well, it's a little bit more complex than just, put the condom on the banana kind of situation. I feel like that is certainly one aspect to it. That's definitely a very important aspect to it. But safe sex to me, honestly, is probably a bit more of like what makes you feel safe. It's more along the lines of like what your personal boundaries are. How does a person make you feel when you're alone with them? Um, it's that kind of thing where like I think that people don't really talk a whole lot about is how do I feel safe while having sex? And that's something that I've definitely struggled with at times because I've definitely didn't always have the best boundaries. I let random people into my life when I shouldn't have. But yeah, I think it's certainly to me like safe sex means just like how do I feel safe while having sex? And what does that mean? I guess you have to kind of learn yourself a little bit. You have to learn what your boundaries are, learn what your red flags are, learn what your green flags are, and kind of go from there.
Yes. And, I love that concept of feeling safe while having sex because I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. Yes, obviously, using protection is important. And I always say that, oral sex is also a time when you can transmit infections. So,
Mhm.
using protection with oral sex as well is really important if you're with a partner that you haven't tested with. So I think that's really key and important to say here. But feeling safe while having sex, now that is a concept that I would love to explore a little bit more
Mhm.
because like you said, you have to discuss your boundaries. You have to know what the other person is comfortable doing and not doing. Um, Even the location of where you're having sex, is that a comfortable place for you or are you feeling uncomfortable? I mean, there's so many different things that can go into feeling safe while you're having sex. And I love that concept. And I love the fact that you're talking about boundaries. How do you encourage people to have these conversations about boundaries? Because I think that that's the key is communication prior to having sex. And a lot of people aren't doing that.
Mhm. Well, I think it comes a lot of disclosure, first of all. So you have to like talk about, you know, your status, for example, your STI status. That's definitely one of them as well. Um, I feel like a lot of people when they discuss boundaries and stuff before having sex, they don't really go into like the whole vetting process. They don't really talk about, or they even don't even talk about themselves a whole lot. I think a lot of the times people don't discuss, hey, I've experienced a sexual assault. I need X, Y, and Z in order to feel safe. Is that something you can work with me on? Is there something, I've experienced, personal trauma of some sort that I need to address, or I have a certain ritual that I have a ritual. I have a ritual that I have to have before I have sex in order for me to feel safe having sex, for example. I
You
have to
do.
take,
You
I
personally
do. I
do.
personally do. Yeah.
Okay.
I have to take a shower. I have to douche and I have to I have a whole like routine that I have to do beforehand. I can't do a spontaneous sexual thing usually. So there's things like that where like I think we don't really have the conversations beforehand. I think the stuff that kind of comes up over time, and that's fine too. But as it depends on how far you want to go with the relationship, how far you want to go with the sexual relationship, that you will have to kind of find time to have those conversations. Definitely disclose as much as you can beforehand, but maybe first thing saying I experienced a sexual assault might be a mood killer, but it is important conversation to have.
I definitely hear you on that, but I, having experienced, abuse in my past, that is not something that I bring up because even though it has changed my life and sort of formed me in a lot of ways, it's not something that I bring up initially, with a new partner or
Right.
a partner that I haven't had for, or
It's scary.
you don't need to disclose all of your, like, deep um dark past, every single time you are with a new person,
Right.
because you're exposing yourself to, it's a little scary,
It's
right? So
vulnerable. Yeah, it's
it's
very
vulnerable.
vulnerable.
That's, yeah, exactly. That's the word I was looking for. Emotional vulnerability, right? So, and not every sexual experience is about that, So, but I think
Right.
that you're right that if you do have a partner and you're growing in your relationship, I think it is important to talk about not every single detail, but what led you to be the way that you are now, and
Mhm.
why you need those boundaries to feel safe. And I think that if you're with a partner that is a respectful partner, they're going to listen and they're going to take note of what you say, and that's really key. Now, if you have a partner that is like, oh, whatever, that's so what they discount you basically. That is a huge red flag and probably time to move on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of like, whatever you feel comfortable disclosing at that given time. It's,
Hmm.
every conversation is going to be different. If you have a partner for that, the conversation is going to be different from someone that you just met. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And all types of relationships exist out there. We're talking
Hmm.
about hookup to marriage and everything in between. So,
Hmm.
I like to really kind of think about everybody. And I really try and encourage communication, whether you're hooking up and it's the first time you are with the person, or you've been in a relationship and married for 25 years. If
Hmm.
you're not communicating about sex, you're not going to get your wants and needs met. And in order to get your wants and needs met, you have to feel safe and comfortable. And talking about boundaries is so important. And it's
Definitely.
interesting that you say you have like a ritual before you have sex, which is interesting to me, because I had never really considered that. But a lot of people have a ritual, and respecting that, having that conversation and respecting that, with your partner is so important.
Yeah, definitely.
Since you write so much about sexual deviancy,
Hmm.
please define deviant in your own words.
Sure. So sexual deviant is actually kind of a antiquated term. It's really old school. It comes from like the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where it basically means perversion. In the medical settings, it kind of relates to strange sexual urges. It could be anything. It's anything that deviates from the norm. It could be anything from kinks, fetishes, homosexuality, to things that are illegal, like rape or bestiality. And it was kind of a catch-all term back then, and so you can kind of see the problem when you're relating just run-of-the-mill homosexuals with bestiality, which I think a lot of the times, there's certain subsect of people that still think that, but you can definitely see the problem there. It creates a stigma, and it creates, people really lost their lives just being themselves. And people were lobotomized for being gay back in like the 40s. It's strange, but language evolves over time. We start learning more about regular people, what their things are. Things are illegal for a reason, but things evolve, and language also evolves over time. So my belief is like everyone's a little bit deviant. You know, we all have a little thing. Even when you think that you won't admit it, you're still a little bit deviant. You know, there's still a thing in you that makes you a little bit weird. You know, so that's why I like using the term, is because I'm kind of taking it back in some ways.
Yes, I do like that. And I did hear you talking on, one of your talks on YouTube about the word queer
Mhm.
and taking the word queer back because it was originally a negative term. And, the LGBTQ community took that word back and now, describe themselves as queer. And I love that for the word deviant too, because really deviancy is, out of the box thinking when it comes to sexuality. And that's what kink is, you know what I mean? And when you look at the statistics of kink, 45% of Americans consider themselves kinky. And
Mhm.
I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was 30 or 35% of Americans have a specific kink or
Mhm.
fetish. So it's really common, to have, out of the box thinking when it comes to sexuality. Everyone's mind explores in different ways and creates different scenarios and fantasies, and a lot of times those fantasies are not, the princess, and the the knight in shining armor. They're, things that are a little sexier, and
Right.
there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly.
Why do you feel breaking stigma is so important regarding sex?
Well, there's a lot to it. So let's break down what is stigma, I guess. Like, it's a prejudice or a discrimination. And we all have them. We're all kind of like, ingrained with them from a societal standpoint or a cultural standpoint. But what we need to understand about stigma is that when we harbor prejudices, discrimination, or stigma, that our sense of understanding others is inherently flawed, right? It's inherently warped. We don't understand the thing fully. When it comes to sex, it's an interrelational activity, usually. It usually involves others. So when there's a cultural stigma around sex, it makes it difficult to discuss this stuff freely. That ignorance hinders us in so many ways that it creates
Totally.
shame, it creates fear, and an opportunity for risk. When we ask questions and when we increase our knowledge about sex, we have a better knowledge. Having better knowledge empowers us to make better decisions when it comes to our sexuality. Shame and stigma can also affect mental health. It can, when you experience shame, you can internalize those feelings and they can manifest as acting out. This is one thing that I had to kind of like address with myself, was like, having sexual repression and acting out. Um, it can lead to addiction, self medication, violence or self harm or other self negative behaviors. Most queer individuals actually experience some form of shame at home or like with family, people at work, at school, with friends, because we live in a heteronormative society
Right.
and being queer isn't considered the norm, even though it's very normal. Uh, we're just treated differently. We're bullied, we're abused. So, a lot of that stuff, we have a higher rate of mental health issues. Um, you know, it just leaves us feeling othered, and stigma can leave people feeling hopeless and so dispelling stigma is really important because it breaks down the social barriers. It breaks down those cultural barriers. It allows us to discuss this stuff freely, and it fosters a sense of community with people that we have experienced the same situations as us. Shame is a very powerful emotion, and it can really do a lot of damage.
Absolutely. And, for me, like throwing the shame out the window, throwing all those societal norms out the window is so important to really becoming sexually liberated. Because if you're holding on to all of that, you're not going to be able to feel free to explore your sexuality in a shame free way. And, my podcast is about destigmatizing conversations about sex. It's exactly what we're talking about here because, when there's shame and there's stigma, like you said, you're never gonna, be comfortable in your own skin. And I want everyone to understand that love and pleasure is for everybody, and we all deserve love and pleasure.
1000%.
That's awesome. Let's talk about consent and specifically what you define as informed consent, which I think is so important.
Right. So informed consent looks like it could be disclosure of status. It could be disclosure of emotional traumas. It could be all kinds of things. It's more than like yes means yes and no means no. It's more like disclosure and acceptance. So like, disclosing that you have HIV or accepting that another person has herpes or whatever, and just being okay with that, and it's okay to not be okay with that as well. It could be like, okay, that's a deal breaker for me, I gotta go. That's fine too. But it's a little bit more than like yes means yes and no means no.
Yes, absolutely. And consent is so important when you're going to have sex with somebody. And I like to mention too that a person can't give consent if they are severely intoxicated or on drugs. And even though they may want to have sex at that moment because they're feeling free and um, their inhibitions are down, really considering that, is your partner completely shit faced,
Mm-hmm.
and should you move forward in that moment, or should you put them in a cab and maybe see them another time, because, uh, consent is so important. And we want to wake up the next morning feeling happy, not
Mm-hmm.
feeling like we regret what happened last night. And when you look at statistics of hookups, men are statistically much happier after I'm talking about heterosexual
Right.
um, sex right now. But men are going to be much higher in the happy category, than women are down here in like the 50 percentile, and men are like up here in the 80th percentile of whether they were happy that they hooked up with a person. You know what I mean? So really considering, consent is important because you want to make sure that you wake up happy and your partner wakes up happy. I mean, I think that's important. Maybe some people don't, and those are the partners you probably don't want to see ever
Right.
again.
Did you see Saltburn?
No, I haven't. Is it a movie?
It's a film, yeah. So they
Okay.
there's a particular scene in there that has to do with consent. Well,
Okay.
there's a couple scenes that actually have to do with consent, and I'll kind of break it down to you if you haven't seen it. If spoiler alert, this if you've been on the internet in the last like month or so, you've probably heard about it. So
Okay.
there's a particular scene where the main guy uh, is kind of watching his crush masturbate in the bathtub, right? That in itself is voyeur. I don't think that's consent. I think that is not consent, not consensual. But then there
For the
is
partner that's being watched.
for the partner that's being watched, correct?
Right.
And then there is right afterwards, after he leaves the bathtub, the main guy licks the bathtub afterwards, and he licks the bathtub. Now that
Wow.
doesn't have to do with consent, I don't think, because there's no other person involved. So I think that is irrelevant. The consent in that
It's just
particular
a
case,
kink.
it's just a kink at that point. It's just a
Right.
kink. And then major spoiler alert: if you have not seen the film, just skip ahead or whatever. But there is another scene in the film that has to do with a dead body, and the body is in the grave. It's buried. It's down, but he is crying on top of the grave because he lost his crush or what have you, and he starts pulling down his pants and he's like humping the grave, right? Bizarre, weird. I screamed when I watched this. I was like, oh my god, I was losing my mind. But consent comes into play in this situation because this is a dead body, this is a dead person. They do
Right.
not have consent over their body, they don't have consent over what this thing that's happening here. And I thought that was really interesting to bring up when it comes to consent, is like the different ways that consent comes into play, especially when we think that it doesn't, right?
Absolutely. And, you mentioned voyeurism as, not being non consensual in a context where the person is not knowing that they're being watched. And that is definitely non consensual. But, there's definitely people that, have a kink for voyeurism and like to watch other people, have sex, masturbate, whatever. I mean, look at porn. I mean, there's a whole industry, right?
Exactly.
About, people watching other people have sex, right? Well, yes, the dead body, right? That is, completely deviant
Hmm.
behavior, and there's no consent there also. How bizarre. I mean, people have some crazy kinks.
It was
And
honestly one of the wildest movies I'd seen in a while. Everyone's talking about it. Highly suggest. Also, just side note, just brilliantly cinematically shot. Like there's so many great visual scenes in that film. It's just really great film.
I'm excited to watch it. I think I'm going to find it tonight.
Yeah, yeah, it's on Amazon,
I
I
need
think.
a, I need a good movie. Okay, so let's talk. We just brought up porn. I brought up porn a couple times already, and I, had never heard of revenge porn.
Yeah.
So I looked it up, thinking I was going to watch some porn, and it was something completely different. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, let's talk about revenge porn. So tell me what you define revenge porn to be, and so let's talk about that.
Yeah. So revenge porn is also called non-consensual pornography, and it is a crime. The severity kind of depends on the jurisdiction. Every state kind of has their own things, but it's basically anyone can be a victim of revenge porn. A couple examples are, an ex who you maybe send sexy pictures to, then they turn around and go post them on the internet. Maybe someone who has photos of you is using them to blackmail you or get back at you in some way, but they're generally private pictures being used for public harassment. Recent kind of stories about this, there was a newscaster in New York. His name was Eric Adame. He was basically moonlighting as a cam boy. And then he had, I guess, a stalker kind of situation where the person was like paying to see him like dance and do his thing on cam. He wasn't having sex with anybody. He was just dancing. He was just like being a sexy guy on the internet. Um,
Was this like an OnlyFans type situation where the person was paying to see them,
so
or
I'm not sure. It's
okay,
camming is different than OnlyFans. I know that much.
okay,
Camming is kind of
okay,
like a live show, whereas
okay,
OnlyFans is recorded. So it's a live show. People are up. I think money is exchanged. It's just kind of like a live sex show or whatever. So basically, uh, the guy was taking screenshots of him unknowingly doing his thing on the
okay,
internet. And then he sent them to his work, the newscast station, to his mother. He found out where his mother lived, sent them to her house, and sent like a whole bunch everywhere else. And so he got fired from his job. All kinds of issues. Now I think he's kind of recovering from it. He's still kind of working through the legal ramifications of all that stuff. But this is all because some guy got mad at him and sent pictures of him to his work. There's also a really great documentary called The Most Hated Man on the Internet on Netflix. It's about a guy named Hunter Moore. He created the website Is Anyone Up? And it's the world's biggest revenge porn website. Most men post pictures, but other ex girlfriends are basically, a lot of them were underage. So being a victim of revenge porn can severely impact people's lives. It can impact their mental health. Perpetrators can expect at minimum heavy fines and sometimes even jail time. So the other thing I want to talk about with revenge porn is artificial intelligence. We have a really strange world that we live in where we can kind of create any kind of image that we want. And
right.
I'm seeing a lot of this stuff happening of like Timothy Chalamet for some strange reason. The internet has really taken to him in a lot of these images where he's being without consent uh put in gay situations, putting gay images. There was one with ASAP Rocky, which I thought was really, who is a rapper, and I was like, this is a very bizarre photo. Like, did he even consent to this? Of course not, because we can just make whatever we want on the internet now. So this is just another avenue for these kind of things to get out of hand. And as artificial intelligence kind of grows in popularity, kind of grows in technique, realism, this could start getting really out of hand for like people that are just everyday people. You can create AI child porn. You can create, basically just anything with just a few photos of people. There was a guy named David Tatum. He was a child psychiatrist. I can't remember where he was, in like Idaho or like South Carolina. I can't remember, but you can Google him, David Tatum. He was arrested for creating AI child porn of his students. Right.
Wow.
It's absolutely crazy. So I predict that AI generated pornography will kind of explode in the next 5 years, and it can really severely harm people's mental health. It can really severely harm people's financial well being, and it can really, really hurt people a lot.
Absolutely. And, it's become so popular, for people to make their own sex tapes, with
Mm-hmm.
the nice cameras that we have, in our pockets with our phones, and people are, creating these sex tapes, and taking sexy pictures, often nude pictures of themselves and sending them to their partners. But you really have to consider when you do that, whether you're identified in that picture and whether that part, do you really trust that other person, to not share that with anybody else. And
Right.
that is very, very key. And so I warn people to really consider whether they want those type of pictures to be taken of them at all, and if so, whose camera,
Right.
is it your camera? Is it your partner's camera that it's on? um, you know Considering that, because you should be the owner of your own sexual, videos and pictures, and being very careful with who you share those with is so
Absolutely.
important.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
laws are changing on this kind of stuff. Japan just had a new law that come into place with upskirting. Upskirting was taking pictures of people under their skirts. Um, they just passed that law, so that's no longer legal in Japan. There's also, I think, one in Italy that just passed a similar law as well. But the laws are kind of not evolving at the same rate
Right.
as
Hmm.
the technology is. So it's just,
Right.
just being aware of it, and being sure who you're sharing these images with, and is kind of key.
Yeah, you're right. And AI just completely changes the game because you can take your face and put it on anybody else's body and really make it look just like you,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's very scary, because if you want to get back at somebody, revenge porn, like you mentioned, getting back at your ex partner or whatever, that you're angry at, um, you can really cause a lot of havoc in people's lives. And just moving on to greener pastures is the best way. Why drag all of the negativity, into your future?
mhm,
Cutting ties and moving on, I think, is, the best way, but that's not everybody's way. So
right,
it's unfortunate, but people do things like this, and it's really quite terrible.
right.
Um, let's talk about gender labels and sexuality labels. I
Sure.
personally hate labels because I think it just like pigeonholes us into one thing, and sometimes one word can encompass so many different things. And also, I feel like over time, it used to be either you're straight or you're gay. Now there's like a zillion things like
Hmm.
in between, and so and like you said, words are constantly evolving, and this is sort of an area where I feel like the evolution has really exploded, and so let's just talk about some labels, and I'm going to describe my own personal how I describe myself just to like get it going. So I
Sure.
personally think of myself as a sapiosexual, meaning that I like people that are
Intelligence.
intelligent, yeah, intelligence turns me on, and so if somebody, has something really interesting to say about something and it's something that I'm interested in, that will definitely clue me in and have my ears like listening more attentively. I also consider myself a pansexual,
Mhm.
and meaning that I am attracted to any gender. It's the person's personality and who they are and their behaviors towards me in general that get me attracted to them. So just curious how you would identify yourself.
Homosexual, demisexual. Also sapiosexual, I suppose. Yeah, I'm obviously like I going back to what we talked about earlier. I just there's this whole thing about the LGBTQIA blah 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 blah, all the alphabet mafia that we all kind of did. And I think that
It's
a lot
gotten
of people,
so long.
it's gotten so long, it's gotten so, we've created all these like subsections of the same community, and we're putting people in boxes and stuff. And I think a lot of some of the discourse that I'm seeing on like Reddit and stuff, people trying to discover their sexuality and stuff, like they just don't know where they belong. And
Right,
so I'm like, well, that's the thing, is like, we're all part of the same community. We're all part of the
right,
queer community. That's why I prefer queer, because it's so inclusive. And there's
right,
even heterosexual people that are are queer because of just like how they are, how open they are, just like whatever. It just means different. Queer just means different. It means a little off kilter if you go back to etymology. I think a lot of us are just simply a little off kilter when it comes to our sexualities. So yeah, I'm a queer person. I'm a homosexual queer person.
and how would you define demisexual?
Demisexual is kind of like on the it's a little bit on the asexual spectrum, but really you're sexually attracted to people who you are emotionally connected with.
Okay, so you have to have that emotional connection, which
Usually, that's why I say
you know
demisexual.
right. I mean, it's a very common characteristic in women that we
Hmm.
need, emotional connection, before we can really have that sexual connection. So that's interesting. And I mean, I like to think of relationships, and I personally am in an open relationship, and I view myself as somebody who is um, interested and wanting to be in an open relationship or a polyamorous relationship. I'm just curious, like what is your relationship style? What is the type of relationship that you like to have?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm monogamish, I would say.
Okay.
I
Okay.
am I prefer having, a standard, primary partner, occasional tertiary partners. I'm kind of just like on the monogamy spectrum, but I'm open. I'm certainly open. Uh, Being gay, you kind of have to be. Everyone's non-monogamous in the gay community. So, I just prefer having, one person that I like to
Yeah, having
be
a
with.
primary partner,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I just like the idea of having a modern relationship, and defining that as just, anything, that you think is maybe out of the box. Um, just being open minded,
Mhm.
completely, and so I like to think of using that word as having a modern relationship. I want to ask you a question that I ask all of my guests, and I always think it's a really fun question to ask, and we talk about why I think it's a good one. So let me ask you, what is your favorite sex position?
Okay, so as much as I talk shit on this sex position, it is my favorite. And
Okay.
it is missionary, and
Okay.
I'll tell you why. I understand there is a whole like subsect of people are like missionary sucks. It's like it's whatever. Like no 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 no. Listen. So Missionary position, number one, is probably the most intimate position. And I think that's why people are kind of repulsed by it. Because it's like we don't want to be that intimate with another person. It's very strange to have that intimacy with another person. Unless you're outside of a relationship with them. But I like it because number one, I get to have that intimate connection with the partner. And not only that, but like the actual, like the way that the anatomy of the prostate goes, that is the best sex position to actually have a prostate massage, right? A prostate orgasm. So ideally, it is the best way for a bottom to come. Now, there is also another kind of variation on the missionary position, which is the pile driving, I suppose. I like that one as well. So that it's a variation on the missionary position that is a little bit more, the top is a little bit more kind of at a 90-degree angle above you, and then they're kind of thrusting down. So that's also my other favorite sex position.
Meaning that the person that's on top is riding the bottom?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of like a cowboy position.
Cowboy position. Well, it's like kind of like pile driving. Do you know what this?
I'm going to have to look that one up. You're going to have to describe the pile driving because that I've never heard before. But you are not the first person to say missionary. And you're absolutely right in that it does create more of an intimate experience because you can see your partner's face, you can look into their eyes. It does create more emotional intimacy, which, you know, in certain circumstances you don't want, but in a lot of circumstances you do want. And, you know, you being demisexual, you know, that makes complete sense because you want that emotional connection. So this particular, you know, position makes complete sense for you. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there are a million variations of missionary. And I like to say that, you know, it can be really boring or it can be really freaking fun, right? Mm-hmm. So please describe the pile driver because I'm learning something new today.
Okay. So I'm the top. I am kind of squatting in a squatting position over the bottom. The bottom's legs are thrown over basically the shoulders.
Okay.
But they're basically kind of like in this rocking position.
Okay.
And the top is in the squatting position above. The penis is going in almost a 90-degree angle. It's like very straight down.
Okay. And that hits your prostate.
Yeah.
In a good place. Okay. Gotcha.
Well, that one doesn't so much hit the prostate as much as it hits the rear side, but it has a very nice prostate massage.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I know the pile driver now. I was envisioning it. I was envisioning it differently. I was envisioning that the bottom was on top. So, you know, the bottom is on the bottom, the top is on the top, and okay. And the movement is going straight down.
Pretty much, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, pile driver.
That's a fun one.
That's a new one for me. I have experienced that one, and it is a fun one. Having said that, I think we're going to end on the pile driver note.
What better way?
What better way, everybody? You know, I want to know if you listeners out there have heard of that position, and or if you learned something new today as well. So where can my listeners find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Dimitri Wylde _ my YouTube channel is Dimitri Wylde. You can find all my stuff there. My podcast is Hook Up Horror Stories, and you can find my blogs, A Deviant's Guide to Sex and The Deviant Diaries, on my website, dimitriwylde.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being with me today. As a licensed physical therapist, I treat conditions such as erectile dysfunction, vaginal dryness and vaginal decreased sensitivity, incontinence, and so many other conditions that can cause sexual dysfunction. So if that's you, I would love to hear from you. Please go to pleaseme.online and reach out to me, or reach out to me on any social media platform, and I certainly will get back to you. Thank you so much, Demi, for being here today. I had such a fun conversation with you.
Thank you for having me. I really had a good time.
Thank you. All right. Take care. Until next time. Visit pleaseme.online Coach Eve, or for more information on products to increase blood flow and overall health. For her curated list of her favorite toys, and for swag that shows that you are a big fan. Please consider supporting the show.